Welcome everyone to the Set Them Free's virtual discussion on the women's role in combating systemic racism and discrimination. I am Cemre Ülker, co-founder of Set Them Free and UN representative of the Journalists and Martyrs Foundation. We have great speakers today who will talk on their diverse experiences, backgrounds, and we will discuss how to collaborate all together to establish peaceful and inclusive societies. We have Dr. Sofia Panda with us to moderate this important session. She's a professor and department chair at California State University at Long Beach in the Department of Religious Studies. Dr. Pandya is the winner of 2016 Advancement of Women Award at California State University from the President's Commission on the Status of Women. She has her bachelor's from UC Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies, Arabic, her master's and PhD from UC Santa Barbara in Religious Studies. A Fulbright scholar, she specializes in women in Islam and more broadly in the contemporary movements within Islam. So without any further ado, it's with a great pleasure for me to leave the platform to Dr. Pandya, and I thank all of our speakers for their wonderful, important contributions to this gathering. Thank you, Dr. Pandya as well.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here today to speak about this very important topic. We're going to start with the biography of Ms. Shea Graham, who's a licensed psychotherapist at Shea Graham. And so Ms. Graham helps people cope with anxiety and depression. Shea earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia, her master's degree from Columbia University, and her postgraduate certificate from Harvard Medical School. Shea is a certified clinical trauma specialist and a clinical social worker. So let's welcome Ms. Graham, and let's ask her some questions. So Ms. Graham, as a psychotherapist, you must have thought about the psychological roots to racist behavior. What are these, and how can we respond more effectively to those causes?
Sure. So systemic racism was a term coined by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton in 1967 to describe the less overt and subtle ways that organizations and institutions discriminate against and disadvantage certain groups based on race. So as a therapist, I work with people to process this pain in a very safe and an understanding environment. So first, in order for us to understand or at least get an understanding of racism, we have to recognize the forces that are keeping racism alive. And Dr. Stephen Roberts, he's a psychologist at Stanford University, he's identified several factors that are keeping racism alive that include in-group loyalty. That's when you treat people who are like you better than you treat others. Systemic segregation. And we see this in churches, Black churches, white churches. We see this in schools, right? There are Black schools and white schools. Legislative power, right? This is when there are politicians whose interests are not representative of the constituents that they serve. Their persistent beliefs in a racial hierarchy. There are media misrepresentations, and you'll see this in the news, you'll see this in movies, images that reinforce negative stereotypes about different groups. And lastly, pacifism. This is when folks recognize that racism exists, but they refuse to do anything about it. And for Americans, our racial identity was determined centuries ago by racist laws meant to preserve racial hierarchies after slavery. So for example, there's the one drop rule, right? Think of the early 20th century. And many states in the South, they have this rule, these codes that said, if a person just has one drop of Black blood, if they have one ancestor from Africa, they are Black. And this stripped many people of their legal rights. Right? And it was done to serve poor whites. And it created this collective white political identity. So when we think about race, we should be reminded of that. And the New York Times a few years ago launched a 1619 project. And in this project, they said that white identity is only coherent when it's defined in opposition to a non-white other. So when we're thinking about our racial identities in America, recognize that these are social, political constructs meant to divide us. And that in America, if we're willing to join together, we can create a better country. So right now, we are under the impression that there are Black political issues like police reform. We fail to realize that white people account for 52% of all police killings. And most people don't realize this because the narrative of white supremacy, it intentionally conceals how racist institutions also harm white people. So sometimes folks, they want to fit into their groups. They want to feel separate and apart from others. And we don't realize how close we are to each other, right? We're so close that if my city is burning, the smoke will hit your neighborhood. And we need to realize that our fates are tied in that sense. So these racist institutions, right, we breathe life into them, right? Folks like you and me, we're the ones who enact and interpret these laws. And once we realize that our institutions, they're not infallible, we'll be more willing to change them. And my hope is that systemic racism will simply become an historic artifact, and it won't be an everyday occurrence.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd like the idea of it becoming a historical artifact. And we've all been racialized in America. You know, we've all been affected by what you mentioned as the foundation of America and this system of racialization and racist structures that many of us are not even conscious of. How can different groups that have been victims of racism and other forms of oppression be allies for each other? Because just as you said, if one city is burning, the other city is filled with that same smoke. But people still go back to that loyalty trope that you just talked about.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, first, I'm hesitant to even accept that all people who experience racism are victims, right? So as a therapist, I'm trained in strength-based theory. This means that I emphasize folks, their self-determination, right? Their strengths. When I work with my clients, I want them to realize that they are resourceful and resilient in the face of adversity. And I can give an example of this. So a couple of months ago, June of this year, I was asked to lead a racial reconciliation workshop at a local nonprofit. And I structured the workshop in the same way that every therapist would, right? I go through a history of racist institutions. I have ways to combat it. And then at the end of my workshop that I was facilitating, I asked folks to go into their breakout rooms. At the end of the workshop, I asked for feedback. And I was so surprised. An African-American participant said he did not like the workshop, right? Because it framed him as a victim. And in that moment, I realized that we're normalizing, right, the conversations of Black people as helpless, right, as victims of racism. And in my own practice, I don't do this. If I'm working with someone who's experienced a sexual assault, I'm not going to call that person a sexual assault victim. I would never do that, right? I would work with this person to practice coping skills when they feel triggered. I would listen to their narratives. I would affirm their recovery, right? And this strength-based approach allows for healing. So back to the workshop, he's telling me, Shea, I did not like this. It felt performative, right? To share my experiences of race, right? It felt like I was being robbed of my dignity, that I was being framed as helpless, that I was being robbed of my agency. And I listened to him. And I think at the end of the workshop, I realized something, that my approach and response to him is something that all allies can do. The first thing that I did, I listened to him. I didn't interrupt him at all. I didn't try to defend myself, right? I asked myself, what can I change about this workshop so that the next time I'm facilitating, I'm helping and I'm not harming anyone, right? At the end of our conversation, I gave him my contact information so that we could connect offline. And so for any ally who wants to participate in this discussion, very difficult discussion, what you can do is you can listen, you can learn, and you can affirm from the people that you want to help.
That's very powerful. I just read the book called White Fragility, and survivors is, maybe that's a better word. I don't know if you like the term survivors, but my question is, survivors of oppression need the white majority to be on board, yet many don't see, many people in the white community, so-called white community, don't see that they're part of the problem, despite their attempts at being allies. What would you like to say to those in the white community who want to promote social justice? Because newspaper headlines are saying that actually liberal whites are a big part of the problem.
Sure. First, a note about white fragility, because I also read the book, and I did not appreciate the author's approach to promoting racial harmony, because her tone wasn't urgent enough, right? At one point, she's reassuring her white audience that they're still good and moral people, even when and if they participate in racism. It's almost like she framed racism and racist beliefs as annoying flaws, right? But racism is more than an annoying flaw, right? It's a cancer almost. It infects everything and everyone. It kills, right? And so that's how we should respond to it. We shouldn't tolerate even small traces of racism in our country, because if it remains, it will only grow, right? And think about that. Think about if you were working with a doctor and he walks in and says, "Oh, you have a little bit of cancer." Right? Think of how bizarre that would sound to you. And would you allow the cancer to remain, or would you undergo the proper radical treatments to remove it from your body, right? And I can say, as someone who has many family members who are survivors of cancer, I would immediately want that cancer removed. And so the problem with white fragility is that the author, her pacifist response to undoing racism allows her readers to believe that their small traces of racism aren't dangerous when they are very dangerous. So as a therapist, there are two things that we can do collectively to promote social justice. The first is to practice a type of radical empathy. And radical empathy simply means practicing compassion and actively trying to understand someone who's nothing like you, right? And the second thing that we can do is we can grant grace to folks who don't deserve it. So there's an example of this, right, in the Bible of this radical grace that I'm describing. It's John chapter 8, right? Jesus is in the temple, he's teaching. The scribes and the Pharisees bring to him a woman, and they say, well, she was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says that you should stone her. What do you want to do? And this was meant to be a trap for Jesus. They wanted to accuse him of breaking the law of Moses. And he simply paused and said, let the person who's without sin cast the first stone. And everyone was convicted, who heard was convicted by his words. They instantly, gradually dropped the stones, walked away. And Jesus goes to the woman and says, who is here? Who's left to condemn you? She says, no one, my Lord. He says, go and sin no more. And this is a great illustration of the type of empathy and grace that we should practice. And it's radical for three reasons. One is that it wasn't safe for Jesus to advocate on her behalf, right? Because she was a condemned woman. So he went outside of the box. Second, he was practicing empathy, right? He didn't join in with the crowd to make her feel terrible, right? He was right next to her, right? And three, he practiced forgiveness and mercy when she should have been condemned, right? That's grace. So what does this radical empathy and grace look like in our own lives in a less spiritual, more human, right, sense, right? Well, we can practice the same type of radical empathy and grace by, when we encounter someone who's nothing like us, trying to find ways to connect. So that means trying to identify similar values, beliefs, maybe trying to find similar interests. And once you do that, if you're able to find the things that you have in common, it can create a sense of this shared kinship with that person. It will make it easier to understand them. And the second thing, practicing grace for us, it just means confronting someone who has offended you and using that moment to teach them rather than to condemn them, right? And if we do that, we can release ourselves from that burden of bitterness. Dr. King says, hate is too heavy a burden to bear, right? We should practice grace.
I really like that. You know, that's just a lovely idea. You know, I'm a religious studies professor, so there's a lot of theology there in the grace and I don't know about forgiveness, but in the giving the person some redemption, some opportunity for redemption, which actually helps both parties, right? So that's very lovely. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to turn now to Vera Güzelsoy, who's a lawyer and a data scientist.
Right.
Vera Güzelsoy is a human rights attorney promoting law and justice. Currently, she's an asylum seeker who had to escape from a mass persecution and torture, ironically with the help of human traffickers by crossing borders through swamps and bushes in cold weather. She worked as a criminal lawyer at Istanbul and Ankara bar associations in Turkey before coming to the United States in 2016. So I assume that's after the July 15th, 2016 coup, right? In Turkey. And so you're a victim of Erdogan's purge, it looks like.
I define myself not victim, but survivor.
Right. Survivor, thank you. I've got to write that in big words. Thank you for the correction twice now. So she qualified as assistant lawyer by European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France in 2016 and passed the exam to be a judge by the Turkey Supreme Council of Judges and Prosecutors. In 2013, she took master's courses in Paris and took French and African civilization education in Dakar, Senegal. You graduated from Galatasaray University Law School, and your master's thesis was on the titled Crime of Deprivation of Liberty Caused by the Government. Published reports are projection of ECHR decisions about right to life and prohibition of torture to the Turkish individual application mechanism. Also hate speech crime and new generation media, choice of law in international complex litigation. Currently, she's working as a data scientist and creating projects related to artificial intelligence and natural language processing. Finally and happily, she's the mother of a 20-month-old girl. That is good news, right?
Right.
Okay, so people often see Turkey as a haven for displaced people and Erdogan as a hero for Muslims. How have you personally been discriminated against by Erdogan? Which weapons does his government use to oppress your community? And how do you survive? How do you fight back?
Well, for displaced people, if you mean the Syrians, it is really hard to define Turkey as a haven because Erdogan governments is just because of his ambition in Middle East. Welcome to Syrians in Turkey. Otherwise, he doesn't have a purpose for humanity. And unfortunately, he doesn't have a proper integration policy. And again, unfortunately, it just increased the racism and polarized plottings in Turkey. Overall, he runs the country without any plans, apart from his own profits and apart from the money funded by United Nations. As you know, United Nations provides some funds for refugees, and I can say that Erdogan is just interested in this money, even if he doesn't spend this money for refugees. In my opinion, all the story started when his corruption is exposed by the policeman. His corruption, his sons and all the ministers' corruption is exposed by the policeman. He put this policeman into the target and he arrested them. After this, judge saw the illegal corruption of Erdogan and terminate the arrest of these policemen. And therefore, Erdogan understood that while law system properly works, he and his profit is not in safe. Thus, he wants to corrupt the law system. This is why, after the coup attempt, 4,000 judges are purged in Turkey. And they are in jail. The judges are in jail and they are tortured. And one of my best friends, Mehmet Tosun, in his 30s, is dead during his detention. He was a successful judge and he was just doing his job. But he was tortured. And it has been 4 years right now. Since 2016, thousands of innocent people are in jail. And where I am in this picture, I am a human rights lawyer and purged and decided to be arrested. And probably I would be tortured too in jails. But thank God, after hiding in forests, after sleeping in streets, I could cross the border with human rights traffickers. But even if it sounds huge, it is just a little drop of water in all the ocean. There are too many other innocent people who are in jail right now. And just because they supporter of Hizmet movement and they just believe in science and they support democracy and they supporter of interfaith dialogue. And this is the whole reason. And there are 864 children who have been jailed with their mothers in jails. Babies are in jail in Turkey. And this is the breaking the law. So the most vulnerable people are pregnant, in jail, and the postpartum period. They are continue to be tortured. For example, I want to give a person as a sample, Fadime Günay, who is 32 years old, and she have been detained just after one day after she gave birth with her baby. So I can totally say that human rights protection in absence in Turkey and respect for human dignity in Turkey is absent. And you also ask how I fight back. I try to preserve my hope and I believe my principles. I try to do my best in my job and I try to speak out and stand up. And I still advocate human rights because it is the only way that I know as a fight back.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you're quite a survivor. And I have also interviewed many survivors of torture, by the way, as part of one of the projects that I'm carrying out. So I've also heard those stories. You know, I have to take medicine before I interview them so that I don't break down or anything. Usually just some Advil. It's very painful. And as a survivor of discrimination, in what ways does it make you more empathetic towards others that have suffered racism and other forms of bigotry? Because I know that in Turkey has a long history of not acknowledging difference, not acknowledging Kurdish identity, not acknowledging other forms of difference. And they don't necessarily, public schools didn't teach multiculturalism. So how has this affected you as somebody who's gone through that process of Ataturkification in Turkey?
Well, actually, because of my job as a human rights attorney, I have always introduced myself as a citizen of the world, far beyond the insane discussion about the race or color. But after experiencing all this discrimination and authoritarian policies as a survivor, I can say that I saw the both sides of the medallion. So I can feel like I am far beyond a human rights attorney. Now I can feel all the injustice all over the world. I can feel every pain, all injustice with all my cells and all my DNAs. Now I can understand better the pain of a mother who is in jail with 2 weeks old baby girl and waiting for tortured. So I can understand better the people who were persecuted by the state of power. And I can understand people who didn't surrender to the power. And I know now how hard it is, how hard to speak out and stand up while you are minority, while you are oppositional. And I know how hard to start over from the stretch. So
I have a quick question, a follow-up to that, because you know, after doing some of the interviews that I did, I wonder, do you feel that knowing what you know, for example, about all those women that gave birth and then just, you know, they're arrested and they have to go await torture and they don't know if they're going to see their babies, does that make you, because sometimes that weighs on me, those stories weigh on me, I'm wondering, does it make you feel as though, does this empathy that you have for others, knowing people's pain, do you feel that it just weighs on you heavily, making you weaker, or does it in some ways make you stronger?
It makes me ambitious to be stronger.
Okay.
Yeah, this is how, because I feel responsible for those moms.
Yeah.
They don't have freedom, but I have. And I have to use this freedom to speak out in behalf of them.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Okay. So you have to be strong.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's not an option. I have to.
Yeah. Good for you. All right. So as a lawyer, I assume you support universal human rights. I already know you do because you just said you did. But you're gonna speak about that. So they're being violated at the global level with the rise of populist leaders like Trump. Okay, let's talk about Trump, right? And Erdogan, Putin, Netanyahu, Modi, you know, and others, Bolsonaro. We could go on. So how can we fight populism? How can we fight this lack of commitment to democracy that we are seeing? Because it's all part of a global picture.
Right, you are totally right. Populism is, in my opinion, as dangerous as discrimination. And populism seriously threatens the quality or even survival of democracy. So therefore, we should have a stronger democracy. But how? First of all, we should have independent courts and independent media, and we should support independent media. It is a must. And as a civil society, we should guide children to think without any prejudice. They couldn't affected by populism. They always think with questions without any prejudice. And as civil society also, we should always be keeping active. We should do walks, we should do peaceful protests. And I think the most important thing is to raise public awareness against populism.
Yeah, that's very, very important, because I think people don't understand the danger of populism. They just see a strong man. It's almost always a man that espouses some of their values. And to go back to Shea, Shea's comments about being loyal to your group. A populist always is a fear monger who says, the other group is going to hurt us, right? We need to be loyal with our group. Don't worry about democracy. Don't worry about these human rights violations. Just be loyal to your group. And when you're speaking about journalists, so of course, Turkey is the world's worst offender in terms of jailing journalists. Isn't that true?
Yes, it's true, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. Okay, so I'd like to turn now. Thank you very much, Vera, Ms. Julesoy. So I'd like to turn now to Ellen Stromberg, who's the regional coordinator of a very important organization. It's the Sisterhood of Salaam, Shalom. And Salam means peace in Arabic, right? Shalom means peace in Hebrew. So Ellen Stromberg is a 20+ year Jewish educator and an interfaith spiritual director and mentor. Currently, she works with students who are training to become bar or bar mitzvah. Ellen's an active volunteer with Sisterhood of Salaam Shalom in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she's the regional coordinator of the region and brings together Muslim and Jewish women who create chapters and become community. Ellen serves on the Sisterhood Social Action Task Force that is advocating for immigrants and asylees. That's really important work that you're doing. Ms. Stromberg, that's really quite impressive. I just hope I can be as active as you. So what's your background from the perspective of discrimination? Can you tell me what led you to be concerned about these issues that you're working so strongly for today?
One of the things that has brought me to this is that whenever I witness discrimination or hear about it, I sometimes think back to how, and this is, in some ways, this is generic. I think back to when I was growing up and where girls were just not as important as boys. And we were never told, oh, you can do this. So this kind of ages me, but we were never told you can do this, you can do that. And I was very quiet as a child, but I think underneath it really, it more than bugged me. It obviously lit a fire under me. And from the time that I was in school, or grew up when we were marching against Vietnam, and this was in high school. I grew up at a time when, during my formative years, Martin Luther King was killed. And when we were hearing about some of the great civil rights leaders, and I wouldn't say witnessing in person, but being very aware of what was happening. And also, I would say that there was an undercurrent for me as a Jew of, it was just, in some ways it was harder, and in some ways there was a lot of, you could tell there was some typecasting. But I really couldn't, I couldn't do any, I was a young kid. I couldn't do anything about it then. I could just be me. But it really, it shaped me. And much later on, I also learned that what shaped me was that my maternal grandparents both came here from Russia in the early 1900s. And had they not done that, who knows what would have happened? And on my father's side, my great grandparents all escaped here in the late 1800s. And because otherwise the boys would get rounded up and sent to fight in armies for 20+ years and often never come back. So that's what shaped me.
So your great grandparents and great grandparents, they were not in Europe during the time of the Holocaust, but they were in Russia during the time of the pogroms. Can
yes.
about that a little bit and the effect that memory has on you today?
You know, my maternal grandmother left Russia. You know, she says she was 15, but we don't know if that was her exact right age. But it was during the time of the pogroms. But if you asked her why she was sent to the United States without her parents, by the way, she would say, "Oh, my father remarried and there were too many girls. So they sent her and some cousins and a sister of hers." But there was definitely, I'm not going to go into more of her life, but I think she lived with a lot of trauma, and she would go through periods where she would just fall silent. And I think that there had to be trauma and pogroms. I can't even tell you what village she came from. But I mean, they came here with nothing. And they found each other. She found my grandfather who was from a different area of Russia. And they built a life that wasn't always easy. And probably had a certain amount of discrimination as Jews.
And some of our listeners maybe don't know what a pogrom is. And then, so if you could explain that. And I also want you to think about the question of whether or not trauma's inherited across generations. I had an African-American student recently tell me, and she's a grandmother now. I think she might even be a great-grandmother. She told me that she just realized now why there was violence in her family. She experienced domestic violence as a little girl. Her parents beat her. And she said, she realized it had to do with intergenerational trauma that took, that wasn't processed in the family,
Yeah.
go all the way back to the slave trade. So what about pogroms? What are pogroms, and how has do you think that intergenerational trauma has affected you?
So pogroms are, I can only describe what happened. I'm not sure I know the actual definition of the word, but pogroms are when Russian soldiers would come in and destroy a village and run everybody out of it. Yeah. And probably torture and rape,
yes,
and destroy the life that the people had. If you've ever seen the film or play version of Fiddler on the Roof, which of course has lovely music and all of that, but in the end, what happened is a pogrom destroyed the village. So I think that not only, so there's that destruction, which in some ways I think was, I think it happened to Jews in many different places in terms of a kind of, a very horrible kind of discrimination and delegitimizing and scapegoating. And I think that has, I think that's continued in many different forms. I think that even now with seeing the, I don't want to say rise of white supremacy, because I think what I'm really learning is how it's been here all along in many different ways. And I don't know, Jews now are not, well, I shouldn't say they're not actively discriminated against, but there are so many more profound ways. I don't want to say that Jews are more discriminated against, but the fact that Jews sometimes feel like they can't go to their synagogues, or what happened in Charlottesville, or the killings in synagogues. I think all of that is a modern form of that. And how did the intergenerational part, it's like, yes, I think absolutely the fear of it. I mean, the way, especially in the Holocaust. I mean, it's one example of a kind of, it's genocide. And we have seen other genocides, and we continue to see them. And the Holocaust is right in there. And I think that especially maybe my generation and older have really, that's really been part of the history of who we are and what we need to do. I don't think, especially I have adult children, and it doesn't, it's not in their DNA as much. They're probably they're even more activists than I am, but so maybe in some ways it is in their DNA, but it's not there as a fear and a worry and of, oh, we have to do this because of the Holocaust.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I have another question for you about your work. And I just also wish you well with all the processing that goes on in the post-pogrom, post-Holocaust, and all of the people that are enduring trauma in the world. It's and I want to give a plug for mental health treatment, because I think that's really important, and there's a stigma for that. So just want to put the plug in. So tell me about the work that Shalom does, because that's just so important. In fact, my own daughter is half Palestinian, and she married a man from a Jewish background. So my daughter is a world peace, my granddaughter is a world peace granddaughter. So I'd like you to talk about the type of work that you do.
Okay. A tiny bit of background. I was doing what we all do when we're sitting there going, oh my God, what am I going to do now? Post November 2016. And two different friends of mine happened to have posted on Facebook about something called Sisterhood of Salaam, Shalom. And I looked at the name and I said, that's the work I have to do now. It has to be about peacemaking. It has to be about reaching out to the other. And you know what? In some ways, it's not, I don't feel like I'm reaching out to the other. I feel like I'm reaching out and getting to know people we have more in common than we have separateness. So the idea, and this is all women. And so I loved that idea. And there were so the Sisterhood of Salaam, Shalom was created when one Jewish woman basically found somebody through a mosque and said, I want to bring together some Jewish women and some Muslim women so we can get to know each other. And that was over 10 years ago. And by the time of November 2016, there were 50 chapters, mostly on the East Coast. And then the election happened, and all of a sudden there were 150 chapters all over the country and in Canada. And so I was one of those people who said, I need to do this. And so I found one other Jewish woman, because at that point, I did not know if I knew any Muslim women. And we spent 3.5 months, first I started with others in the Jewish community who I thought might have interfaith connections. So fast forward, it took us 3.5 months, and we found 10 Jewish women and 10 Muslim women, and we started meeting. And also in that group were 4 Turkish women from Pacifica out in the area that I live in, which is from the Hizmet movement. And then one of them came to me and said, well, I want to be in your group. And I said, well, we're full. And so she said, I'm going to bring you 5 other women, and then you'll have to start another chapter. And that's exactly what happened. And so from there, and so this was on the peninsula of the Bay Area. And then it started expanding. And I love the work because it was Shea who said about listening. I love listening to people's stories. And that's where the spiritual direction part comes in. Mm-hmm. You take your own stuff and you put it aside and you simply listen, and you get to know who is this other person and what is their story, and who are their children and what are their concerns. I thought it was going to be way more political at first, but it wasn't. It was, who are we as human beings? fast forward to, was it 2019? There had been the horrible shootings in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, and our synagogue held just a memorial, a program for anybody. It wasn't just for Jews. And so I invited my my Muslim sisters especially, and they came and they sat in the front row with us. And I swear, I think before then there probably had never been Muslim women hijabi coming to our synagogue. And it was a very profound statement. And I feel like it really, just the statement, just the fact of standing up for each other has been extraordinarily important. And we unfortunately had the opportunity to stand up for our Muslim brethren when the killings happened in Christchurch. And
Christchurch,
yeah. So one other thing I want to mention is that Sisterhood of Salaam, Shalom, well, they started by, let's get to know each other, let's fight hate together. Recently, the national, or they like to call it the central office because they're Canadian too. There's now 4 social action groups that are of which the fighting immigrant and asylees is one. There recently started also a racial justice action group to work. I want to say work behind the scenes. It's more than standing up for with signs. I mean, I'm not going to say don't do that, but it's about really learning the issues, and it's learning where to speak out, and it's learning where to create community by reaching out to someone that you don't know. And I also, I want to go back to, I wrote down a couple of things that Shea had said about listening and learning and affirming, because I just, those are so core and so central.
And I have a question for you just about that, because I'm wondering, it's this is a sisterhood that you're talking about. And and you're bringing up Shea's comments about listening and empathy. And I'm wondering if there is a brotherhood of this going on, or if it's just work that women fall more naturally to, not because of their essential characters, but because we're conditioned to be better at listening, and we're conditioned, socialized to be better at demonstrating empathy. But so do you think that, have you heard of men doing this? Are there brotherhoods of Shalom, Salam brotherhoods?
I don't think they call themselves brotherhood, because, but they're, so what I have heard of is that very often, and many of the women are married to men, and the men start saying, well, I want to do that. It's like, well, you can't be in our sisterhood. And so there are groups where the husbands get together.
Okay.
Often what I've heard usually is, well, they do things like they go hiking in a park, or I don't know that they do exactly what we do, but when we've had family events, the husbands bond, but they usually, where do you work and what do you do? And there's a great commonality there too. So what I really think is that men will do it differently, but there is also, I don't think that women have we're the only ones who know how to create this kind of camaraderie and listening and caring, but I think that we do it in different ways. And so the women will get together and say, oh my gosh, can you believe? But the truth is they're bonding in the ways that they bond. And what I like to think is that really behind the scenes, we're the ones creating the path that's very different than what men might do on their own. But I think that they have strengths. Yeah.
That's very important work. And there was recently a newspaper article of that that argued that women should not follow the path of male leaders, by leaning in, but rather women leaders should be women leaders as they do it. Right. Yeah. Just saw that was, and I thought, why do we have to imitate, the traditional androcentric, which means male-centric way of leadership? Yeah, but thanks so much for your really, really important work. And I'm going to turn now to Eylül Gündüz, who's a PhD student at Dalhousie University. So Ms. Gündüz is a sociologist. She did her master's degree in sociology and worked as a graduate research assistant. She also conducted research projects on various topics such as social distancing, intergroup relations, education, migration, the Kurdish question, and gender issues. She's currently doing her PhD in sociology and working on citizenship and social implications of passports. So Ms. Gündüz, most people in the US don't know very much about the Kurdish community at all, much less that they've been discriminated against. And there's over 35 million Kurds who don't have their own states, and they've been discriminated, or there's, you know, they've been discriminated against everywhere. So can you speak to the Kurdish history of discrimination as well as what's happening to the Kurdish community in Erdogan's government?
Yeah, sure. So let me introduce Kurdish population first. They are the largest ethnic group in Middle East, and they're settled mainly in the southeastern part of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Armenia. So they're all around, but in Turkey, they're approximately 20 million, which makes up to 25% of total Turkish population, right? So in order to understand the Kurdish problem in Turkey, we should go back to the Turkish Republic history. So since the beginning of 1920s, the Kemalist regime, which initiated this republic, it started a modernization project which aimed at linguistic, cultural, and ethnically homogeneous nation. So out of the remnants of Ottoman Empire, which had multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilinguistic entity, right? So for that homogeneous nation, like Turkish state required to make some elimination, assimilation of different groups to the dominant Turkish national identity, right? So Turkey started an aggressive and assimilationist policies towards Kurdish minorities. They denied basic human rights. They didn't permit them to express their Kurdish language or identity. They banned their publications. Didn't permit their TV broadcasting, their religious preaching, and even education in their native tongue, right? So these are all the processes, of course, Kurdish movement to become Kurdish nationalists, to become politicized. Of course, not only Kurdish people or their identity or their language was denied by Turkish government, but also, but the reason why they were the biggest threat to the republic, because they were the largest linguistic minority. So after all, the PKK, which is an acronym in Kurdish for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, after 1980s, they launched a so-called terrorist group which fought against Turkish military. So after the clashes between PKK and Turkish army, that resulted in more than 30,000 casualties, right? It was awful. So of course it comes until today. There was a ceasefire between 2013 and 15 under Erdogan's government in Turkey between PKK, but that didn't continue because of the again continuing conflicts and Erdogan's plans on Syria and like negotiating those Kurdish lands, etc. So of course now it continues. But when we think about the political domain, since 1990s, pro-Kurdish parties were banned from political sphere. So it was also the thing, like, you know, it politicizing Kurdish peasantry, but it also on the other hand, it also can like worsen the oppression towards Kurdish people. They were displaced from their villages, etc. So it continued like that. But finally, after 2015, the pro-Kurdish party, which looked for the Kurdish people's interests, it finally entered the parliament and has the highest rate of women deputies among other parties, which is of course a nice thing for the Kurdish women, right? But unfortunately, the leader of the party, along with some deputies, they're in jail for 3 years now. So that's another case. So this is the Kurdish situation in Turkey.
And I want to ask you about Kurdish women and women in general. What's happening to the post-coup attempt, July 15, 2016 coup attempt? And, we have in Turkey, there's the populist leader, Erdogan. What's happening to women, and in particular, what's happening to Kurdish women?
So again, the Kurdish women's issue, it is related to, again, Turkish Republic's women reforms, because Kemalist regime from the beginning, it introduced the reforms to improve political and civil rights of women, right? But the Kemalist women's rights discourse puts the national identity above any sort of identity, ethnic or religious. So Turkish feminist women feel like they are indebted to Kemalist modernization of women. So that is to say, Kurdish women are doubly marginalized in terms of they're not included in, like their identity, ethnic identity were severely crushed, as well as they become relatively disadvantaged if you compare it to Turkish women, because because of their lack of their linguistic abilities, they cannot seek their rights towards government, especially in the eastern part of Turkey. Above 30 women mostly do not speak, Turkish, and they are they faced with honor killings, as well as they're suffering from political and social patriarchal practices of their culture, right? So so within their political atmosphere, they started to develop a feminist conception after they also had this sexual sexist glances from their Kurdish nationalist men, right? So after that, they couldn't find their place in Turkish feminism, because obviously Kurdish women were like, they were under oblivion by Kurdish and Turkish nationalists, as well as Turkish feminism failed to have their voices in their gatherings, right? So so after 1990s, they organized their voices, and they had to become politically active, because they couldn't speak on behalf of their ethnicity and the issues they were facing. And it all continued, and of course, being women is right now is kind of difficult in Turkey, and it's now popular after the brutal murder of the Pınar Gültekin and the latest issues about Istanbul Convention, etc. So after that, you can also realize that even in between feminist groups, there are discriminations towards each other, as well as Kurdish women, of course, they're minority of the minority. They are also facing, like, for example, they're getting less media representation, and they're getting more threats from the oppressive rural Turkish regime in southeastern Turkey, as well as in the western parts. So yeah, it continues like that. So
I'm wondering about Kurdish women survivors of repression. Yeah, because do they have social and political strategies or certain actions, certain art forms, or that they use to cope or to push back, to resist?
Well, of course, as far as I observed when I went to a case study in the eastern part of Turkey, I could observe that Kurdish women gathered and they made their, even to survive their culture, they made song nights, poem nights. Like they also wanted to, you know, practice their culture and identity and their language, as well as they wanted to, you know, orally transfer it to their children in order not to forget all of the identity. This also tries to, they also try to continue this in Western part, but of course they are a minority part in the Western part. So this is also harder because they're labeled as, you know, outward, tribal, or they were even labeled as mountain Turks right before. Right. So it's harder. But if you look at their like for example their music, even if the Kurdish culture is not accepted in Turkish arena or in Turkish society, I may say, their music, for example, was accepted. We can say Ahmet Kaya, we can say Ibrahim Tatlıses, although it was banned, like their language was banned and they couldn't use Kurdish lyrics, but they could use their Kurdish music, of course. And also, like for example, now even in the western cities of Turkish people are fond of the, you know, halay, which is a Kurdish traditional dance. So, you know, there's this cultural appropriation of Kurdish, you know, music and dance, we may say. But like apart from that, it's still very, very hard that they express themselves in their own languages, within their own, you know, culture and their own practices, etc.
Thanks very much for speaking about the Kurdish issue, which is often neglected when we speak about Turkey. Oftentimes people just don't even bring up the Kurdish issue, unfortunately, and it's very important because Kurds are almost 20% of the Turkish population. And so, you know, it's just almost criminal to neglect it, to bring that up. And the largest group of people that don't have a state.
Yeah.
State. Yeah. So, you know, we've been getting some questions and also just some comments. And I have them on my phone. They've been texted to me. So one of the comments is to me, actually, from one of my good friends in Germany. She's an asylum seeker. Her name is Felice, and she's got 3 beautiful children. Hello, Felice, I love you. And I want to give a shout out to all displaced people everywhere. Be survivors. You can make it. And then we have a comment for you, Eylül, from Gülmiraç. She says, I love you so much, and we're proud of you as a family, my dear sister. And she sends you kisses and a flower. Okay. And from Hafsa Girdap, she says, hi, everybody. Thanks for this unique conversation. Sophia, you're an amazing inspiration. Thank you, Hafsa. Hatice Sarihan says, it's nice to see all of you women. You inspired us to be heard. And that's nice to hear, right? We're inspiring other women. When all of you speak, you're inspiring other women. Esra Aydin says, hi, everyone. My question is for all the speakers. What are your motivations to combat discrimination and cultivate a culture of peace? So why don't you guys go around and just say something, you know, quick about that? Shea, how about you first? What are your motivations? How are you motivated to combat discrimination and cultivate a culture of peace?
Sure, my motivations. So I was having a conversation with my husband the other day, and we were watching the news, and he was mortified because my husband also does not enjoy watching acts of violence. And he said, is this the right place to raise a child? Is this a safe place to raise a family? Right? Is America a safe place? And instantly I felt this new passion to try to change the world, if not the entire world, at least the community that I live in, to make it a more tolerant society, to make it a safe society, right? To make it somewhat more cohesive. And so I'm motivated not just for myself so that I can live comfortably, so that my children and generations to come can exist in a world that accepts and embraces them.
That's very powerful. How about you, Vera?
As I mentioned before, I believe in human rights, and we can meet under the umbrella of human rights, and this is the only way to not to see any color, any ethnic rules, or anything, any other discriminative features. We can be just the humans, and it makes me hope. It gives me hope, and it gave me the motivation to continue. And I mentioned also for all my colleagues and friends in jail, I feel the responsibility to continue to be strong, and this is the biggest motivation for me.
And by the way, Hafsa says to you, your experiences, actually, no, sorry, I've got it. Let me actually go to Ellen now. Ellen, can you answer that? What motivates you? What motivates you to continue to fight against discrimination?
What motivates me is just the little amounts that I'm willing to look at news. It just makes me want to speak out, and it also makes me want to educate. And that's where my 13-year-old students come in. I have two right now who are what they will read from Torah is the line, "Justice, justice shall you pursue." And I was able to gently move them in the direction of, well, look what's happening today. How are you going to do that? So what motivates me is to motivate the next generation.
Yeah, me too. What motivates me is my granddaughter, by the way, right? That little granddaughter. She's 6 years old. Okay, how about you, Elul? What motivates you?
For me, I feel like we're obliged to be motivated because we cannot escape from this sexist and discriminative environment, right? All around the world. I mean, see, we're from different backgrounds, but still we're living like, parallel issues with towards like gender, towards gender issues, right? I think like without looking at the religious background, ideological background, even the sexual orientation or like, ethnic identity, we should acknowledge all specific women's experience and hear their voice in their terms, and like, without denying their identity and without subjecting them to any political or ideological, prejudices, right? Also, like specifically, I just want to add that it also, consumes us, it tires us really much if we compare us to men, because our energy is really drained in terms of, this discrimination and everything. I think we should also focus not just what can women do, but also what should and must men do, right? Because obviously it's not just our issue, but it's also their issue. They could also be nice temples in front of the next generations and so on and so forth.
Yes. Okay, going back to the comments, Hafsa Girdab says, Shea, your experience and your views are so important to hear. Thank you. And she also says, Vera, I hear you, I feel you, and I believe you. Mustafa Bayrak says, hi, everyone. Hi, Mustafa. What a vital topic you're discussing. I think egoism is also similar to racism and discrimination. Interesting. And then I've got Hafsa saying, Ellen, what you told us about the discrimination within the historical context sheds also some light on what's going on in today's world. Thanks for sharing. And we have Nedim Ulya says, she says, greetings from Sweden. Hello. And Mark Murgila says, hi from the UK. So hi, Mark. Zuleika Jolak or Kolak says, you're an amazing group. I love each and every one of you. So here you go. I love you back, Zuleika. Okay. And so that's all the comments that we have. And I think that actually, you know, I have one last thing I want to ask of Shea, because we've been talking a lot about trauma. And I know that in the United States, there's not so much of a stigma to go get treatment. But in a lot of the communities that I work with, you know, I've been busy interviewing and writing a book on the Turkish refugee situation. And it's not just, you know, it's not just the Turkish refugees. It's just, you know, like Ellen, you spoke about intergenerational trauma, and Eylül spoke about the trauma of the Kurds. You know, what would you say to communities that avoid mental health treatment for religious reasons, or for they just think it makes them weak? Oftentimes, you know, sometimes people will say, okay, my wife can go, but I won't go because I don't want to be seen as weak. So then he just cries in the park, you know, and I've interviewed people that just go cry in the park. So what would you say, Shea, about communities that feel that mental health treatment weakens them or emasculates them, or somehow it's not part of their cultural or religious repertoire?
Well, I would have a different response based on their opposition. A bit about my background. I am a person of faith, and I tell this story so often when people ask, you know, why did you decide to be a therapist? It's not that I decided, I'm just not gifted at anything else. So when I was younger, you know, I was praying, I was asking God, what should I do with my life? I was maybe in 3rd grade, and he said, help people. That is your job, right? And so as a therapist, I don't see my work as a replacement for faith and prayer. I see myself as a helper, right? And so what I say is not scripture. It is not doctrine. I use evidence-based interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, and mindfulness. If you want a great way of thinking about it, in the same way that someone would get a personal trainer, right? New Year's, one of your resolutions is to get in shape. And so if you're serious about it, you'll hire a professional who will show you how to use the equipment in the gym so that you don't hurt yourself. The same professional will also tell you what meals to eat, right? So that you can get in shape. Think of a therapist as a personal trainer for your emotions, right? We're showing you how to use the tools, right? You already have the strength to do the exercise. And so for folks who are thinking about, well, using a therapist will make me seem weak. If you have a therapist who believes in strength-based therapy, that should not be the case, right? If anything, we're helping you to identify your strengths. And therapy is also HIPAA compliant, and so it's confidential. No one has to know that you're using this tool. If you're not comfortable, if you don't want to put it on a billboard, that's fine as well. I understand the stigma, and I'm not telling people that they have to broadcast it. It's really no one else's concern or business what you choose to do in your time and how you choose to build a wellness plan for yourself. So I would encourage folks who are interested, the first thing to do is a bit of research. Find out what works for people who, let's say, have anxiety or depression or trauma, right? Because there are different interventions depending on the presenting issue, right? For trauma, you would use I use narrative exposure therapy, right? Find a bit of an intervention. Find a trained professional in your area, and most professionals will offer a free consultation. There's no harm in really just having a conversation with someone to ask a few questions if you're feeling a bit of hesitation in that area.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Shea. I think it's really important because, you know, when we're dealing with trauma, we have to be strong. You know, Vera was pointing to this. We don't really have a choice. You know, we either have children or grandchildren, the next generation. We have to be strong. We have to be strong enough to combat all of these different forms of discrimination and depression. And the strength that is required for that begins with us. It begins with us. We have to be strong. And so with that, I'd like to conclude And I want to thank all of you individually. Thank you to Ms. Ellen Stromberg and Ms. Elu Junduz and Ms. Vera Gülüs Soy and also Ms. Shea Graham, and then Cemre Ülker, who introduced us in the beginning, and to all of our listeners. And I'm wishing everybody strength in their struggles. Thank you very much.